Thank you. Here we go. Thank you so much, Dr. Graham, for that introduction. And I want to take a moment to thank and acknowledge the leadership team that's been so crucial in having this policy brief be published. So I'm going to first give them a moment to introduce themselves. So if the leadership team of the consortium could go ahead and introduce themselves briefly with their name and say hi, that would be great. So starting with Nina.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nina Platerati. I'm co-president of the DC Student Consortium, and I'm a rising third year in the Elliott School at GW. And I'm very excited to be here with you all today. A lot of work has gone into this event and this brief, so this is going to be awesome. And I'll pass it over to Romani.
Thank you, Nina. Hi, everyone. I'm the co-president, so thank you so much, Nina, for always working with me, and thank you for other members of the consortium for just creating such a great network, and Dr. Graham really explained it beautifully. Thank you all for all of this work that's gone into the publishing this brief is really needed in this time, just promoting inclusive and diverse perspectives within this field. So I'm really excited that it's published, and I'll pass it on to Mimi. She's on my screen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mimi. I'm the social media director, and I'm super excited to be here today. I will pass it to, I will pass it to Bia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bia, or Beatriz. I am the vice president of the DC Student Consortium on Women, Peace, and Security. Happy to be here. I'll pass it off to Eleanor.
Hi guys, I'm Eleanor. I'm also a rising third year in the Elliott School, and I'm the director of outreach and advocacy, and I'm really excited to be here today. And I'll pass it on to Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm the secretary of the consortium, and I'm a rising sophomore. I'll pass it to Christina.
Oh, hi, sorry, me, Christina, hi. I'm Christina. I was on the leadership team last year. I was the director of student recruitment. I will pass it on to Bailey.
Hi everyone, I'm Bailey. I'm the director of publications. I also wanted to do a shout out to the former leadership team that's here today because they also put a lot of effort into that. So I will give them a moment to also introduce themselves. So Noelle.
I didn't think I was going to say anything, but hi, I'm Noelle. I'm the former president and Bailey's roommate, and it's great to see this come to fruition. Alice and Madeline have done amazing work, and I really want to give a big shout out to Alice in particular. They have been such a big advocate for this issue and for LGBTQ plus issues within the consortium, and this brief wouldn't have happened without them, but additionally, I've learned so much from them, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to get to learn more. Oh, Rachel, go ahead.
I'll be quick. Thanks, y'all. I served on the leadership team since 2021, served in multiple positions, helping on the research side, the policy side, and also the social media side. Super, super excited to be here with you all today and have this important conversation, especially, I don't know if we'll talk about it, but in light of recent Supreme Court decisions.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for introducing yourselves and for all of the work that you've put into supporting us to make today possible. I'm so excited to celebrate that this brief is finally published. But before we begin our event, I want to start with a land acknowledgement, which means beginning a gathering by naming the traditional native inhabitants of the land in order to offer recognition and respect to Indigenous peoples. So we acknowledge that we are on the native lands of the Piscataway, Nutchitink, and Pamunkey peoples, among others. And we also recognize that inequities in Washington, D.C. are based on past and present racial injustice, including the stolen labor of people of African descent. But I want to say thank you all so much for joining us here today for our event. I want to take a moment to celebrate and thank all of the authors of the brief. So this includes our panelists, Madeline, Nicholas, Megan, and Sam, and the other authors who weren't able to join as panelists, which includes Taylor Blanc and Christina Renziti. Thank you all so much for all of the work you put into this. And a special shout out to Madeline Elliott, who served as the co-lead editor with me. This project has been a year in the making, and I'm so excited to spend today celebrating all of the work that went into this, and also celebrate that it's Pride Month. So happy Pride, everyone. I also want to note before we begin the discussion that we will have time for Q&A at the end of the event. So if you have questions or comments throughout the event, please feel free to include them in the chat. We will do our best to get to all questions and comments, but of course we have a limited time for the Q&A portion. But once we reach the Q&A time, we'll explain how we will run it. But thank you all so much for joining us. So I will be moderating the discussion today. My name is Alice Shylander. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm currently the Communications and Program Manager at the Public Leadership Education Network, where I work to train, inspire, and empower the next generation of women, trans, and non-binary public policymakers. And I graduated from the Elliott School, oh gosh, like in 2021, and where I got connected with other folks who were interested in forming the consortium. And I'm so glad to still be connected with them today. But I am now going to turn it over to my panelists to introduce themselves and begin the discussion. So I'm going to first turn it over to Madeline to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Madeline Elliott, and I use she, her pronouns. I am currently in my full-time work working for Accenture Federal Services, which is a subsidiary of Accenture, if you've heard of it in the larger consulting world. I work specifically on federal projects, so I'm at the Department of Education right now. And I'm also an Elliott School alum. I graduated this past May and have been involved with the consortium since its inception in various ways, so really excited to be here. And I can pass to Nick to introduce himself next.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Nick Marak, he, them pronouns. I'm finishing my PhD in linguistics at Georgetown University, where my research focuses on language in military and veteran populations. And then I also focus on the intersection of gender, sexuality, and language. So when I came upon this opportunity to work with Alice and Madeline, I was super excited. Because I really wanted to expand my research interests outside of linguistics and into like queer and international relations. Before I started my PhD, I was a naval officer and served during Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So living under the regime of compulsory heterosexuality really did influence and inform the type of research that I wanted to do. And this past year, I served as our president of our student veterans organization, where I focused on queering veteran and military spaces. I worked with Tahina Montoya, who's a major in the Air Force and also part of the consortium in creating a women's veterans initiative at Georgetown. And this past year, I was also appointed to the board of directors of Student Veterans of America. So trying to, I guess, have impact in military and veteran spaces in support of national security. Thank you.
I suppose I can go next. Hi, I'm Megan. I recently graduated from the Elliott School in May, so that was nice. And currently I'm waiting to start an internship with DoD in August, so that'll be fun. I came to the consortium because I thought it would be something interesting to try out. All of this was new to me, and I knew the way this world was turning, we needed to include more diverse perspectives. And I definitely think even now more than ever, this work is super important. So that was kind of my drive to start and join an organization such as this. And I learned so much during the opportunity or during the writing process and actually seeing something published, because by the way, I've never had anything published before. This is new to me. So it's all very exciting. And I, as someone who's hoping to go into the security industry, I guess, I think that this is a great place to start and a great perspective to start with, and be able to bring this to where I hope to work one day. But yes, I've learned so much from this experience, and thank you.
Awesome. I think that leaves me as the last panelist. Hi, everyone. My name is Sam. I graduated with my master's in security policy studies from the George Washington University this past May. I'm currently serving as an open source analyst for a company that takes satellite images. So most of my analysis is GeoInt, geospatial intelligence, or SocialInt, which is social media intelligence. Previously, I co-hosted a podcast on gender in the non-proliferation space, and I've done some research at GW about LGBTQ plus inclusion in Parliament. So looking forward to chatting today. Thank you.
Great, thank you all so much. It has been such an awesome and incredible opportunity to be able to work with you all over this past year. So I am curious to hear a little bit more about what you learned through the process of writing the LGBTQ Inclusion and Gender, Peace, and Security policy brief, and why do you believe it's important to include queer and trans folks in the gender, peace, and security agenda? So I'm going to go in opposite order and turn it to Sam first.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. I think one thing that I learned is that there's a big difference between de jure and de facto, which, forgive me, I don't if I was pronouncing that incorrectly, but basically there's a difference between legal provision of rights and actually the society accepting that and upholding those rights. So for example, during my research for the brief, I found that only 29 countries at the time of writing legalized same-sex marriage. So, but even within that framework, there was discrimination. So for example, in Taiwan, you cannot marry a same-sex partner who is a national of a country where it is illegal to have same-sex marriage. So that's a very specific example that I researched for the brief, but basically just realizing that all these statements are really great and all this legislation is really great, but what happens on the ground matters.
Absolutely, thank you, Sam. Megan, if you want to share a little bit more about what you learned during the policy brief writing process.
Yeah, it was overall rather overwhelming, not underwhelming, overwhelming, because I could see there's lots of research being done, but still there was so much more to be had. And the fact that there's a lot of people here, at least in the US, that still, I mean, it's just like how far we can go, but still we've not gone far enough at all. There's still people who believe these, people like this shouldn't exist. And that is just terrifying, and just, I don't know how to get past all of that if you can't convince everyone that everyone should be included. It just seems like there's so much more work to be done. We need to bring more people into just learning about all of this. But I think there's positivity, definitely. Stuff like this, organizations like this, that helps.
Absolutely, Megan. And we see with the recent Supreme Court decision that we have so much further to go in order to strengthen LGBTQ rights within the United States and beyond. So thank you. Nick, if you want to share a little bit about what you learned during this writing process.
Yeah, it was a really fun writing process. The thing that so as a linguist, I usually collect my own research, my own data, and I analyze it. So this was a different way of writing for me. But in regard to like the content, I think what really surprised me, not really surprised, maybe disappointed, I'm not really sure, but like homework protectionist states that have homework protectionist policies, for instance, and how it really does pass over the I guess the main folks who are responsible for discrimination of LGBTQ people to like churches and other organizations that aren't being held accountable. And we see that in the US, but I think writing about it sort of provided a new lens to it. So hopefully with more research like this, we can develop frameworks to strategize for nonprofits, or maybe create recommendations for nonprofits who are going into specific countries that actively persecute and discriminate against LGBTQ people, on ways of working with those organizations that are actually doing the discriminating.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Nick. And I'm looking forward to diving in a little bit more about what you wrote about Ecuador and homo protectionist policies later on as well. But Madeline, if you want to go ahead and talk about what you learned during the writing and the editing process.
Yes, sure. So I think I learned so much in this last year and a half about like the writing and editing process. I, again, similar to what Nick mentioned, have done a lot of my research, and just in general, the trajectory of grad school is that you do a lot of research on your own, and then you sort of do the synthesis and editing process by yourself. So I think working with a group and seeing how iterative the process truly can be it really gives me a lot of respect for people who do it, I think, for a living every day, because it goes through so many cycles of changes and just gradual perfections to, the writing and the language. In terms of, I guess, big takeaways from like writing and editing the entire brief as a whole, I think the thing that I'm still just consistently astonished by is the complete lack of data on LGBTQ people and their inclusion in the majority of countries in the world. Namely, I think considering the US as a global human rights leader, at least as the way we tout ourselves as a global human rights leader, the major lack of data on LGBTQ people in the US was really astonishing. And it was very difficult to find even practicing academics within the US. One of the major academics we ended up citing was in the UK, which tells you something about sort of the availability and even practice of doing research in these spaces. The other thing I will just, I guess, briefly say about major takeaways is that we were able to find a correlation in this section that Christina and I wrote sort of on the status quo between the actual economic cost of discrimination against LGBTQ people in various countries. And we were able to pull specific examples from India, where a research team actually analyzed like what happens when you have homophobic and transphobic employment policies and firing practices in a country, like what that does to the country's global output as a whole. And so one year that we ended up pulling and citing in the brief was like a loss of over $32 billion for India's economy just from exclusion of LGBTQ people in the workforce. And so I think seeing very concrete examples like that is a really powerful argument to use whenever people question or ask why LGBTQ people need to be given space and given resources. So yeah, those are a couple of my big takeaways. I know we'll dive in a little more later, but.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Madeline. That was such a stark figure to find and include in our brief. Absolutely. So I'm going to move on to our next question, which is at the heart of our brief, which is what is missing from women, peace and security analysis when LGBTQ people are left out, and how can including LGBTQ people in WPS analysis lead to more peace and security worldwide? So I'm going to start with Nick this time. What's left out of WPS analysis when we exclude LGBTQ people?
When we exclude LGBT people or queer people, we exclude their lived experiences. We don't offer them a seat at the table. We don't allow queer people to advocate for themselves and also advocate as their experience as being equal to other people's experiences, regardless of gender and sexualities. So I think that's the primary concern that we identify through this type of research.
Thank you. Madeline, if you don't mind also adding on what we miss when we exclude LGBTQ people from women, peace, and security analysis.
Sure. I guess briefly, just for anyone on the call who is not fully familiar with WPS, Women, Peace, and Security is a policy movement that was essentially started at the UN in 2000. It's based on Security Resolution 1325. And it is the gist of it is that women are critical international actors in the spaces of peace and security and need to be included as such and mainstreamed throughout the process, right? So that means not only being given leadership positions, but also being included throughout the entire process of peace resolution whenever there's conflict going on in countries, mainstreaming them into national security conversations, and not, again, just in moments of crisis, but also in moments of stability, right, through the whole process. So that's a little more about WPS. I think in terms of what's left out whenever queer people are excluded from WPS, the easy and simple answer is that an entire people group, an entire population is left out of the conversation. I think we can look at history of just the world, but in specific countries as well, and see what happens when people groups are excluded, and how dangerous that can be for not only their lives and livelihoods, but also for the rest of society when you are marginalizing a specific group. But I think specifically another thing that's left out and continued is the data gap. Whenever you don't have LGBTQ voices in leadership positions, but also just in positions throughout the process, it's much easier to forget about them. It becomes much easier for policymakers to ignore when you have only, white cis men in positions of power. You see why it took until 2000 to have a movement to include women in the process. And even that term we know isn't inclusive enough. So now I think the idea is, in order to fully queer that space, we need to have voices and faces that are actually representative of what the world and what populations look like.
Thank you so much, Madeline. And also thank you for your brief overview of what the Women, Peace and Security agenda is and its foundations and why we're here today to talk about queer inclusion in that agenda. So thank you. Megan, do you mind sharing a little bit about what we miss when we exclude LGBTQ people from Women, Peace and Security conversations?
Yeah, definitely. So I can echo both Nick's and Madeline's comments about the data gap, because I think that's one of the most important things that we're seeing, along with, their stories and lived experiences. And I also think that those stories and lived experiences add to the diverse perspectives that people bring. And it seems a little bit like opposites, because people are saying we want diverse perspectives, we want open minds, and then yet you choose not to hire or you choose not to be inclusive. So it's a little bit hypocritical. That's the most just seems difficult to me. And that part is one of the hardest parts about this sort of work, is that there is a lot of that there. We still yet haven't gone far enough. I just think people are missing out in general. It's a very general answer, but you're not going to get the government, you're not going to get the workplace that you would get otherwise. As we can see, your whole economy can be, affected by not including these people. I mean, how much more evidence do you need?
Yeah, absolutely. And we see again and again during Pride Month that there are a number of corporations or organizations that pinkwash and love to change their logo to a pride flag, and then in July they forget about queer people all over again, and then the cycle continues year after year. But we need to hire queer people, we need to fund queer people, we need to fund queer projects and include queer people at every stage in this process. Absolutely. So Sam, if you don't mind also contributing what we miss when queer people are a part of the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one thing that we address straight off in the brief is that the language women, peace and security movement in and of itself is discriminatory. Instead, we try to refer to it as the gender, peace and security movement, because anyone who has taken the gender class knows that women does not necessarily equal gender. So in that case, also talking more specifically about peace and security settings,
LGBTQ plus people have different opportunities and challenges. So for example, transgender refugees not being admitted or respected because perhaps their ID states that their sex is different than their gender. So those two things I think are big points that we talk about in the report.
Absolutely, Sam, and such a great point. And that's one that we continue to reiterate throughout the brief, that shifting from women, peace, and security to gender, peace, and security includes all folks who are marginalized under the patriarchy and people who are disproportionately impacted by conflict. So thank you, Sam. And next, I want to talk a little bit about the gender, peace, and security space, but also how queer and trans people, we live at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities. Many folks do. And the LGBTQ community is incredibly diverse. And we know that when queer and trans people live at the intersection of multiple identities, for example, disability community, people of color from the global South, et cetera, they become even further marginalized from these conversations. So how do we work to include queer and trans people and recognize the LGBTQ community and all of its diversity? So I'm going to start with Madeline.
I'll give you 2 short answers and then I'll get longer because I'm not good at giving short answers. It's programs and it's funding. Funding, okay? So I think like to briefly touch on what's going on right now in the US with the Supreme Court with Roe v. Wade, right? What we're seeing is that in order to cause awareness about a policy change, people have to share their lived experience. And that's what we call re-traumatizing in a lot of ways, right? So I think there is absolutely value in queer people sharing their lived experiences through conflict, through peace resolution, through the entire process. But there's an element of they shouldn't have to, right? They shouldn't have to share what they've experienced or the intersections that they're living at in order to have the same human rights as anyone else. So I think one thing that we really need to focus on is having existing programs and existing funding and resources for those programs in place. Having those programs and those resources come from the government, be government sanctioned. And I think that is the absolute best way that you can include, but also support queer people in these conversations and spaces. Because again, lastly, just to touch on a little bit of what we see in Pride Month is you often see corporations and even governments like highlighting various events as part of Pride by bringing in speakers who identify as LGBTQ plus or hosting panels of people who are queer people. But at the end of the day, are they actually funding and supporting those people and building in resources for them or opportunities for them to have an inroad at that company or at a government position? 99% of the time, the answer is no. So whenever you look at that in normal life, it's pretty terrifying. But then, of course, when you have, conflict settings and increased violence, it becomes even more dangerous when those programs aren't already existing and already in place and the resources aren't available to queer people who are suffering violence.
Thank you so much, Madeline. And that's so true. I'm seeing that happening in this moment as well. And we're seeing that transmasculine people in particular are being left out of conversations on how abortion, limited and restricting abortion access is impacting them. So we need to talk about people who live at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities and how they're impacted by these policies. So I'm gonna move next to Sam. Can you talk a little bit about how do we recognize the LGBTQ community in all of its diversity and what happens when we leave out those the most marginalized within our community?
Definitely. I think the first step is to stop referring to it as a community, singular, and start referring to it as communities, plural. The LGBTQ persons all have common experiences, but those experiences are still also determined by their socioeconomic status, their religion, their age, etc. So by referring to different communities, I think we can fully recognize the diversity within the common shared experience of being queer. And then how do we ensure that those voices are actually heard? I'm going to repeat what Madeline mostly stated, is that there needs to be programs that have trauma-informed surveys and people, social workers in particular, that are able to have those conversations and gather the lived experiences in a way that is not re-traumatizing for the populations, but still gathers the necessary information to promote to policymakers.
Thank you so much, Sam. And also thank you for that clarification about LGBTQ communities. I think that language is so important, and we made that decision in our brief to talk about LGBTQ communities rather than a singular community. So thank you. That language shift is really important. So next I'm going to turn to Megan. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think is missing when we don't include LGBTQ people who live at other identities, who live at other marginalized identities?
Right. Kind of like what I had said earlier, it kind of all relates to you're missing the perspective of someone who has a say in the matter. And it also seemed hypocritical when you say, oh, we want to include everyone, and then you don't, because that they're not. And they're missing out on a portion of the population who does legally have a say. So I just feel like people are missing out on bringing in a diverse perspective, bringing in people who matter and who do have a say.
Absolutely. And when we continue to elevate only people who live at the intersection of one marginalized identity, we miss a lot. So Nick, I'm going to turn it to you. What do you think we're missing when we don't include diverse perspectives within the LGBTQ community and diverse lived experiences?
I really liked what Sam had mentioned about LGBTQ communities as if we are some monolith. And so attention to that language is really important. And if anyone's familiar with Anderson's work on imagined communities, how people develop these monolithic identities, we can sort of see that, a specific demographic, a specific group is sort of controlling the narrative. And what I saw, for instance, during Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the folks who were controlling the narrative were typically cisgender, gay, white men. And progress was definitely made, but I think that at the same time, it still continued to marginalize folks that didn't fit underneath that category. And so we have this development of homonormative ideals. And I think we all sort of see that, especially if we don't conform to wanting to get married, wanting to have monogamous relationships within marriage. Differences in perspective on what gender and sexualities are under the LGBTQ umbrella continues to be marginalized. And so shifting away from that kind of language and understanding within our, I'll use the language here because it's really hard to not, within our community, understanding that there is nuance underneath this umbrella.
Thank you, Nick, for bringing up that that policy as well and how this applied to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And yeah, I really believe that queer analysis helps us uproot this idea of binaries more holistically too. When we look at binaries within peace and security spaces of protector and protected, harmed and those who harm, we shift our understanding and create a more nuanced analysis of peace and security and how we achieve peace and security as well. So yeah, queer analysis is needed, and we also need to include diverse perspectives within that. So thank you all for sharing. So now I'm going to turn it to specific questions to our panelists. So Madeline, how do you believe that we see LGBTQ communities experience increased vulnerability before, during, and after conflict? And how do we mainstream addressing the experiences of LGBTQ populations during phases of conflict?
It's a great question, and one that I think we've struggled to answer for centuries. So I don't expect to answer it fully in my answer, as I'm not an expert. I would be remiss without first mentioning that one thing that makes answering this question very difficult is, once again, the data gap. we do not have statistics and data in many countries on how LGBTQ plus populations are affected in times of conflict, the before, during, and after. And so based on this, it can be very hard to then draw conclusions about what is most helpful and inclusive when we don't have concrete examples from the past of how it's been done, right? So that is difficult, but also an opportunity that we need to embrace. One thing that we did find while researching the brief and is included in the early sections of the brief is that there is concrete evidence that in times of conflict, whenever there are scarce resources, societal pressures tend to increase as those resources become scarce and people become heightened in those times. And so some of the documented societal pressures that tend to rise during times of conflict and violence when countries experience this are homophobia, transphobia, racism, sexism, xenophobia. We see all of these things tend to rise and thus, of course, further marginalize communities that are already experiencing conflict or violence. And so the best ways to really include LGBTQ plus people before, during, and after conflict is by passing the mic, giving LGBTQ plus people positions of leadership who have the knowledge and foresight to anticipate the best ways to support and elevate the voices of LGBTQ plus people and, of course, the before, during, and after cycles of conflict. Again, this doesn't only refer to positions of leadership, but also, again, setting aside separate funding to address the marginalizations that can impact someone's experience and increase the support that they might need based on the intersections that they live at. And then I guess the final thing to kind of mention here is that we need vital reform to our international humanitarian law. This is at the UN. This is at most international multilateral organizations, because there is still a complete lack of protection for crimes and acts of violence against LGBTQ plus people during times of conflict or violence. There's a lack of prosecution and there's a lack of accountability whenever this happens, and still also just a lack of awareness and a lack of publication. It's not promoted in the media. It's usually covered up or not researched at all. So I think we need, to conclude on my very long answer, we need to make changes to our international humanitarian law process. And I think we need to include LGBTQ plus people in those spaces and give them positions of leadership to advocate for the best ways to change those laws and put practices in place that will prevent those sorts of marginalizations and exclusions in the future. And then, of course, excuse me, we need to increase the data collection that we're doing in times of conflict on LGBTQ plus people specifically, so that we have examples moving forward of the best ways to actually support them.
Thank you so much, Madeline. And I totally agree. We need to include LGBTQ people into our analysis at all phases of conflict. So for these next questions, because we're running a little bit short on time, I'm going to ask the panelists to keep their responses very brief. But Nick, if you could touch a little bit more on why it's so important to close gaps in the data about the experiences of LGBTQ communities in conflict-affected settings.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that we experience our genders and our sexualities as interconnected, and how we begin to learn and understand our genders are socially construed and linguistically mediated. In the US and most countries, because I don't like to speak in absolutes, we're assigned a gender at birth with the expectation that we'll fulfill the expectations of that gender. That is, like, fulfill gender roles, be heterosexual, continue the patriarchal cycle. And for many people, those expectations are taken for granted. And in a lot of cases, like here in the US right now, it's enforced. If we don't conform, we can face discrimination and, in worst cases, persecution and abuse. And to the point of linguistically mediated, I was reading a recent report from Outright Action International and Human Rights Watch. The nonprofit conducted interviews throughout Afghanistan with queer people, and in their methodologies, noted that the Afghan terminology for gender and sexual identities do not neatly correspond with English terms. And so this is just one example of why it's important that we not only include queer people in doing this type of research, but also we should ensure that we include individuals who have the cultural and linguistic competencies for queer people in conflict-affected communities that we're studying. And so a gender, peace, and security agenda should have a framework in which cultural understandings of gender and sexuality are adaptable to conflict-affected communities. We had mentioned briefly the Women, Peace, and Security agenda was a good starting point. However, it maintained the gender binary, it conflated gender with women, and it failed to account for individuals outside what we understand as heteronormativity. And so a gender, peace, and security agenda should be able to account for those differences. And such terminology for gender and sexuality should be consistent across our research so that future recommendations that we make can be systematic. There is a caveat though. I think that we should be cognizant of the difference between adapting and imposing. A second point is this type of research will help inform governments and other organizations on how to aid and support or how to do the aid and support that we do. For example, since August, LGBTQ Afghans have been targeted and persecuted in Afghanistan, and few countries are providing support for those individuals. Canada's Department of Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship said that they can't really track or target or provide direct support for these folks because they have no way of identifying them. At the same time, if they create a system to identify them, then they can compromise the security of those individuals. So that's a question, I think, for further research. How do we help queer people without compromising their well-being? And lastly, queer people who are displaced not only face xenophobic discrimination, but also likely face discrimination and abuse from their own communities wherever they go. So this type of research can provide cultural competencies to LGBTQ organizations like here in the US on how to provide direct support to like the new Afghan diaspora that we have. And so within the gender, peace, and security enterprise of queering women, peace, and security and international relations, I think from my experience this past year, it could also benefit from having social scientists like linguists, anthropologists, psychologists, and anthropologists involved in this type of work.
Thank you so much, Nick. So for the sake of time, because I want to leave time for Q&A, Sam and Megan, I am so sorry, but I'm not going to ask your direct questions, but I'm excited to invite audience questions at this moment. So if you have a question, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question directly, or you can put it into the chat and we will read it out for our panelists to answer. Great, and I can see that Dr. Graham has just added the link to our policy brief in the chat. So thank you so much, Dr. Graham. And while folks are thinking of their questions, I'm going to go ahead and drop in the chat as well a document that includes different resources that have been compiled by the panel on how to learn more about queering, women, peace, and security, and then as well professional resources for LGBTQ folks who want to break out into the international affairs space. So I'm going to drop the link to that document in the chat. If you also know of resources, it's an open resource document, so please feel free to add your own. Oh, and while I'm doing that, I'll go ahead and read this question to our panelists from Bia, which was, what was something surprising to you that you learned while doing your research for the brief? So I'm going to open that up to any of our panelists, but priority for Sam and Megan, who didn't get their individual questions. What was something surprising that you learned during the policy brief writing process?
I can quickly answer. One of the things that I found one of the most shocking was how many countries did not recognize same-sex marriages or anything. And, we all thought that, oh, well, yes, if we thought the US was behind, just wait for the rest of the world. it's just there's so much we haven't done, and so many people who are being discriminated, like everyone. There's no, it's too overwhelming. But yes, that was the most surprising, and it's very hard to get over that first hurdle.
One of these days after the pandemic, I'll learn how to unmute myself before I start talking. That is something that continues to surprise me, and that we continue to see that, I don't know, that these rights are under attack. The recent Supreme Court decision, we saw that they are priming themselves to opening up the case of same-sex marriage again in the United States. And what does that mean if the United States positions itself as a human rights leader, but we're seeing them roll back these rights on reproductive health access, when we see them roll back these rights on queer and trans rights? It positions us very poorly to act as a human rights leader, and I think this will ultimately have a negative consequence for multitudes of areas within our foreign policy to act as a leader. Okay, and then let's see. So I see from Professor Sotomayor. I wonder, where do we go from here? Is there something that Congress or NGOs need to read? Is there a need to have an academic conversation, and how can we advertise your findings? I love that last question. Please, please, please get this policy brief in the hands of folks who you think need to learn a little bit more about how to queer the gender, peace, and security space. At the very end of the brief, we include resources for NGOs who are interested in exploring the first steps on how to include LGBTQ people within their analysis. For example, feminist organizations need to do that outreach and need to reach out to LGBTQ civil society organizations, whether there are those who work on the international level, but especially those who work at the grassroots level. We need to see feminist organizations building that coalition because we know that we can't defeat the patriarchy without including queer and trans people. But I'm going to open that to my other panelists. Where do you think we go from here, and how can we publicize these findings?
I think briefly before we dive into this question, I believe Joe had a question that was a kind of a follow-up to that. So if you would like to come off mute and pose that, then maybe we can answer them all together.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am applying to government jobs and using USA jobs. And one of the things that I recently discovered is to have an account, you have to use your government legal name, and you can't use your pronouns. There's no avenue to include information about yourself related to gender and sexuality. And so my question is kind of related to, yes, the technical side, but also this idea of like, if you build these structures that attract LGBT people, then they will come. Build it and they will come. And there's all these avenues for like employee affinity groups, or, I think as another panelist said before, like having panel discussions with government advocates around these issues during Pride Month. But why aren't we building it so that we can attract trans and non-binary people to go into those positions so that others can follow? And what would your suggestions be?
I guess I can, sorry, I don't know if Alice was about something. I can chip in quickly and say, I think the reason we don't have those mandated structures is very simple and has already been discussed on this call. And that's that there is an active surge of homophobia and attack on queer people's rights that we're seeing in the US. I think Roe v. Wade was such a pivotal step in terms of what we might be facing going forward. And so it's as disappointing as it is about USA jobs, and I'm very sorry you're experiencing that. I think it lines up with the precedents that have been set in place for a long time by past administrations to continue the exclusion of queer people from not only facets of society, but especially government jobs and government positions. So I think that said, it's so crucial for civil society to step up in this time. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing with civil society organizations that work in the WPS or GPS space, right? Is we're seeing the burden of addressing these issues and also providing employment and spaces for voices to be heard fall on civil society organizations. So in terms of applying for jobs too, I would say if it's something you're interested in, potentially consider some orgs that would be more accepting and considering of the situation we find ourselves in. But that said, my hope moving forward is that, you know, within civil society, we can push to make those changes at a larger scale and at the government level.
I wanted to add to that, but also respond with to Rachel's question as well. I think having more people who identify as queer in these institutions can affect change. Right now, within the military, for instance, there are working groups looking at how to be more inclusive of trans people and non-binary people in the military, and a place where we call each other by our ranks. Like, we don't really need to have pronouns. I mean, by virtue of putting on the uniform, you're performing a gender and a sexuality that's related to the military. You're essentially doing drag. So I think having those folks in power to change the institution from within is, in my opinion, a lot more productive than just abolishing the system and creating something completely new.
Thank you so much, Madeline, Nick, for your responses. I just wanted to throw in a quick plug. I am planning an event that's happening tomorrow, and that'll address a lot of the topics that you just talked about. So the event is called Launching Your Career as an LGBTQIA+ professional. And at that event, we'll explore, how do you navigate this space as a queer job seeker? How do you navigate conversations around gender identity, pronouns? How do we navigate workspaces that often reinforce rigid gender norms? And how do you navigate that as a queer person, as a trans person, et cetera. So I'm going to drop the link in the chat. The event is free, and it's through my organization, the Public Leadership Education Network, and I hope to see some folks here at that event. But yeah, we'll have an opportunity to explore a lot of those topics of how do you navigate a space that wasn't meant for you, and how to navigate those different spaces of how out you really want to be. So I think that that's a great question. I know there are so many other questions in the chat that we didn't have an opportunity to get to, and I apologize. But I want to thank you all so much for coming here today. This was such a great event. I hope you have an opportunity to check out the resource list that we have that has been put in the chat, and we'll also include it in a follow-up email. I want to thank everyone for attending. And I want to thank everyone in the audience. I invite you all to follow the consortium on our social media platforms, so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And please check out the consortium's website and keep an eye out for the consortium's strategic plan for the next academic year. And I look forward to seeing all of the exciting things the consortium has planned. And I'll now hand it over to Bailey to share final thoughts from the consortium.
Again, I just wanted to thank you again, Alice and Madeline, and all of you that contributed to the brief. I know this has been a really long time coming. I'm super excited about it. Again, you can look at the link online to read the brief yourself if you haven't had a chance to already. And thank you for the timely discussion today. I also did want to draw attention to the fact that the consortium does have a book club that's going on tonight over the topic of abortion. You do not have to have read the book at all to participate in it. Nina will be dropping the link. So this is just going to be a safe space for everyone if you do want to come discuss it in the recent decision that was made.
Thank you so much, Bailey, for sharing that. I hope other folks are able to attend, process, grieve, talk about the book. And I believe that the book's author is going to be present at the discussion, right?
So she actually, we learned this afterwards, but the person who's coming did help contribute to the book. I don't think she's quoted, but she did help contribute to the book. But she is I don't know if she continues to be a clinic escort, but she also, okay, Rachel's saying yes. And she's also, I think, an abortion doula. So we will have a guest speaker with us, and we're really, this is a very timely, important conversation that everyone said. So if you can join us, we would love you to.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming to our event. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.